So we take almost the completely opposite approach to recruiting, so complete shift of perspective. But I want to tell you a little bit of the story about how I got there, because it wasn't something we just decided to do one day. I had a perfectly normal career in theater, and then I had a perfectly normal career doing UX in the usual sorts of places, although I seem to have ended up doing a lot of nonprofits. They were big nonprofits like National Cancer Institute and IEEE, and the Open University. So they looked more like a big organization. And we did all the usual agonizing over how do we get the exact right people into our research. But there's something that happened as we started shifting into elections, which is that we began thinking more about people out on the jagged edge, people who were not just like all the rest of us, right? That nice middle class, the well-spoken, the requirement we used to have that you could speak English well and were articulate, right? That's a real limiting requirement. It means that people who are not verbally articulate don't get heard in research. And so we began thinking about those issues. We've had a few elections in the US as well. We seem to be beyond this increasing periodicity as we get more chaotic, along with chaos weather. I got involved in 2000, like so many people. We woke up one day and realized that arguably interface design, the design of the ballot, had changed the course of history. In 2008 or so, we woke up and realized that a simple mortgage reconciliation form had probably changed the course of history as well by crashing the economy. I have to say that as tough as the domains I've worked in, elections have been tougher than anything I've ever done. I'm 17 years into it and still learning every day about how they really work. But there are three things that make them really, really challenging for a quantitative researcher like myself who thinks that, p-values are something that ought to go on pies or something. One is that they are inherently quantitative. In the end, an election is a giant survey, right? It is, in fact, an enumeration of the opinions of people in the electorate about what they want. So everything else we do, all of the exit polls and advance polls on how the election is going to be, are all an attempt to sort of predict a real result. One of the things this means is that the field is full of political scientists who all think that when you came in with a paper and said, well, we worked with about 20 people, they're like, what? It took us 3 rounds to get a journal paper done once, and we only persisted because the editors kept saying, just keep going, please, just stick with us, because we really want this paper. But trying to get them to understand the notion of iterative design and user research with small numbers and narrative and story and all the stuff that we've been talking about was and is an exceptional challenge. And the next challenge is that they are political. Now, this seems like an obvious thing to say because we are deciding politics with them, but I mean that the entire process is political. They are hemmed in by election law. Whatever has been written into law in any country guides those elections, and there are things you can't do. I'm spending a great deal of my time right now suffering over the fact that there's some changes going on with voter registration, and the laws are getting written include the following phrase. Unless they have actively declined registration. And so we get phrases in the form that say, do you decline registration? Right? That sort of thing. And the lawyers are like, no, no, this is the legal language. We must use the legal language. And we're beginning to win that battle. But it's also political in the sense that because they make a real difference in how government works, there are a lot of stakeholders. A lot of stakeholders. We're working on a project in California around this voter registration thing. There are 2 task forces of good government groups, get out the vote groups, immigrant rights groups, citizenship communities who have been meeting weekly for over a year. These are smart people with a lot to say and a lot to say about how their community will be affected, and all of them have to be considered. So the other problem when you say I've worked with 20 people is which 20? Are my people included at all? Is anybody who looks like me in your research? And the last is this issue, which is that the electorate is wildly diverse and getting more wildly diverse. We can't really do research in most of the United States without considering second languages. It's just part of the world. And so that's just the kind of baseline about what kind of led us to some of this. I should also say, just to clarify, we don't do campaigns. We don't do political campaigns at all. We work primarily with election administration. We have sought to find this sweet spot in the middle that is where the advocates trust us, the voters trust us, and the election officials trust us. And so we often have funny conversations where I'm talking to all three groups in the same day. We all know that we're all talking to each other, but they can't quite have the conversation together, so it's all coming through us about how a form will be written or how voter education will be written. The other aspect of that relationship, I think, is summed up by one of the mottos of the civic design community, at least in the US, which is work with and not for. Right? And that has really begun to change our view of the relationship between us as kind of a research institute and the people we work with, both the election officials, the advocates, and the voters. This started for me when I was working at National Cancer Institute, where we had a lovely lab and great stakeholder involvement, and it was a really good situation. But in the end, I started doing things that seemed fairly subtle, like moving my chair so that instead of facing them, I was actually sitting right next to the person, looking at the computer with them, which sounds awfully intrusive. But what do you know about having a child with brain cancer? Anybody? What do you know about nursing your father through stage 4 lung cancer diagnosed at stage 4, right? People are experts in their own lives. They are experts in their own experiences. And we were asking about some highly emotional things. People cried in our sessions. People hugged us at the end of it. You know, people asked us medical questions, and we obviously deferred them, but we actually started having medical experts on hand so that at the end of the session, they could talk to somebody about issues that had gotten raised in that session. It's a completely different relationship. And the other thing about working in nonprofits and some branches of government, although not all of them, is that people often love the organization. I hit this first at the Open University, when people really wanted to be part of testing and work at the OU. When we started asking photographers for photographs that we could use for our personas at NCI, people were offering up photographs for us because we were working on cancer research, right? Or the MS Society, and so on. So that's a very different relationship than a business that's trying to make a product to sell you. And neither of them are good or bad, it's just different. Right? The other thing this changes is a relationship with participants with respect to consent. Caroline Jarrett, a researcher here in the US, did some work with DEFRA, agriculture folks, and they asked every participant if they wanted to be anonymous or wanted to be named. About half of the participants wanted to be named, one so much so that he did a CNN interview about his experience, which is about as unanonymous as you can get. Right? People want to be recognized for their part of it. We do a lot of work with an inner city Baltimore community. And after one session, one of the women asked me, does this make a difference? I mean, is this just fun, or does this actually change the world a little bit? Right? I think that we need to think about and actually tap into the fact that we're asking people to give something of themselves, and that maybe we need to share what happens at the end. On a project I'm working with that involves this Baltimore community, we've actually raised the issue of when we finally get into a releasable piece of code, that maybe we need to have a party for them and invite them all back in. Make sure it gets installed right on their computers. Thank them for being part of it. Show them the pieces that they were part of, instead of making it just, you're this, you know, participant 45. And it also has let us think differently about issues about self-reporting errors. We know that people will say lots of things about voting. One of the challenges for us is finding non-voters. In the US, the average is about 73% voter registration. So we're looking for a small part of the population that both isn't registered or doesn't vote regularly and is willing to say so. And sometimes they're, yeah, right, don't step on the thing. Sometimes their interest in sort of proving that they're part of our world, it reveals itself in a perfectly natural way. I sat on the wall outside of a library with a young Chicana who said, oh yeah, you know, I do this voting stuff. And what she proceeded to tell me about was a story, I think, about signing a petition for something, and maybe filling out a voter registration form. And then she said, yeah, but this voting stuff, I just don't know enough about it, and that's why I stopped doing it. She was 19, right? And she said it as though she's been doing it for a really long time. So, but I learned a lot from that. I learned what she doesn't know about the difference between a petition and voter registration and actually voting. I learned that she was putting on a really brave face, but really wanted to be part of something and wasn't being given the information that she needed to do it. And so that's that as well. The project that we were working on was, it was actually a very fascinating coalition in California where a nonprofit funded a project to bring together the advocates and the election officials to get them to learn to work together. And it's actually been wildly successful. Drafting of new election law now happens with the entire group, so that by the time it gets to voting on it in the legislature, the advocates are all weighed in, thus the year-long process, right? Much different than passing a bill or getting a bill in the process and then fighting about it, where it's much harder to change. Their goal, of course, is to increase participation, especially in underserved communities. And we were asked to find out how voters get information, what kind of information they need, and will that information be another rung on the ladder of bringing them into full participation in society. So that meant that we were looking at low literacy communities, poverty communities, the immigrant community, the many, many immigrant communities in California, and thinking about what is the difference between how people who do vote and don't vote absorb and use information. Now, if you ever recruited this sort of work, it's really hard. California is a really big state, and just getting into enough of those communities, I don't actually happen to live there, was this giant challenge. We actually thought we would work with the League of Women Voters. It turns out what they knew were nice voters. While they might think they knew their community, they really didn't. And so we kind of changed our approach to that, to thinking about a different way of reaching into them. And so we began to think about an idea that we called Go Where the People Are. Instead of trying to identify individuals, we identified places. We identified connectors in the community. We identified the community centers where there were likely to be people. And we went there. So we went places like a neighborhood gym in Modesto, California, public libraries virtually everywhere, the community of people that hang around public libraries, at least in the US, because it includes parents with kids, it includes older adults with leisure learning time, it includes homeless people using it as a shelter, it includes students. It's a wildly, wildly diverse community, even in not very diverse communities. Government offices turned out to be surprisingly effective. The kind of place where you go to line up to get your birth certificate or to get your business registered. There tends to be a lot of time standing around. It's great for us. My favorite was a wedding party. They were at the county clerk's office in Los Angeles. The bride and groom were late, and we got the whole wedding party. Right. So thinking about location as a kind of sample. And we learned lots of very counterintuitive things, which I guess in retrospect maybe is sort of obvious. But we were at an LGBT community center in the evening. There was a torch singer, there was gay bingo, there were AIDS testing going on. And we rather expected them to be issue voters, right? That there'd been a recent gay rights measure in California, and we actually expected to hear about that in the thing, and we didn't. That was actually a surprise. It was also one of the most internally diverse communities that we worked with, one that sort of protected its own, and where people actually came here because they could be themselves. And so by being part of that, by sitting in their library, we got lots of things like that. We went to farmers markets. One of the challenges for voter registration is people who don't have a regular address. Homeless encampments. Farmers markets are a great place to find them. We found people who didn't have a regular address because their life was irregular. We found people who didn't have a regular address because they live on a rural road that doesn't have a proper address. So that gave us a chance to see whether they could, in fact, figure out that there is really a way to tell the voting authorities where you live and where you should vote. And my absolute favorite was a homeless encampment in the Occupy Sacramento group. And I spent a couple of hours sitting on a tarp, cross-legged behind the soup kitchen, talking to people. And we had longtime voters in those areas, people I really believe were longtime voters because of the level of detail they went into in discussing the candidates and the measures in each of those elections. Fascinating. So, doing intercepts. How many of you have done them? Ah, great. That's a much bigger number than I often get. So that's lovely. I guess it's because we're all researchers. We've thought a lot about the question of how you inject yourself into somebody's life in this busy day in a very transitory way. Lots of places we thought would be good because they had lots of traffic turned out to be not very good because that traffic is going somewhere with a purpose. So you need to find places where there's enough people but where they linger. So a farmer's market where you can get lunch, right? A library where you're hanging out or you're waiting while your kid goes to story time or something like that. But once you've picked that location, you have to be kind of fearless. Now, I grew up in inner city New York, and I am pretty fearless about walking up to people. Maybe you're not, so you have to think about who you are. But one of my absolute favorite stories, we were in a plaza outside of a library that's both a community and college library in downtown San Jose, which sounds more bucolic than it is. And there was a group of guys with bikes and motorcycles. And Dana Chisnell, my partner in this project, was aghast when I went bounding over to them. She's like, woo, they're a little scary looking. But we're on a street corner. What's going to happen to me, right? So I went bounding over to them, and I said, hi, listen, my name's Whitney. We're doing some stuff about voters. Are you guys voters? Are you registered to vote? And they went, And we went, look like I got rid of you. First question. And I went, great, you're exactly who we're looking for. And they were like, shit, we're stuck with her. But we ended up going up to the library. They were all coming to study together. Dana took one of them, I took one of them. The other three joined in the conversation and listened in and reminded their friends of stories to tell. And it was a fantastic moment, right? Because of just simply not being afraid of walking up to people. A few things that we found that are good tips. We use our name. We don't do the organization. Nobody's ever heard of the Center for Civic Design anywhere, let alone the people we're trying to talk to. It's a meaningless name to give them. But hi, I'm Whitney, right? I've immediately said, I'm going to tell you who I am. We wear a name badge, right? It doesn't really matter. It's just a card I printed up. But there's something about having my name hanging around my neck so they can see it if they can't hear it. That you're about to ask them to give you some of their time, well, we'll give them some of us as well. So we're friendly. Now, we're also, middle-aged white women, right? So that's who we are. I mean, we also carry clipboards that have a badge on a sign on the back that says, "Help us make voting easier," and we're not selling anything. Right? So like that. I think that's all of that story. We also work in very casual spaces, sitting anywhere we can sit. And that's also interesting because, once again, you're entering someone's life. It's their cafe table. It's who's at that cafe table. It's where they came to lunch, thinking about why they're there and what that means to them. It also means that your research materials have to be mobile enough. We started with soft-backed notebooks that our guides were in, and they're floppy, and you can't write on them. So a hardback notebook, pre-printing and pre-binding your research guides or your note-taking materials. Acknowledging that they will see what you're writing. Right? We've had people lean over and correct things and make sure you get that information, and we now just encourage them. Right? Be part of it. Help us write down what you want to write down about yourself. We do demographics at the very end. We just to confirm that we've got a range of ages and that we've got, things. And the last thing we asked is, are there any disabilities we should know about? Because, we want to make sure we have a good range of people. And we learn all kinds of things about people's lives from that last question. And I think putting it at the end makes a difference because now it's just confirming some details for that pesky research stuff we have to do rather than something that's kind of a barrier. You also need to think about speaking their language. I mean this in all senses of that, right? So there's what register do you speak to them in, right? Do you come down to a more plain language register, the sort of things we would usually do? It also means speaking their cultural language, whatever that might be. We had a participant at the Norwalk County Clerk's office. We were showing them a series of pages pulled from voter guides around the state and asking them to put a Post-it note on each one that they liked, and then we'd go back and talk about it. And this guy really was a biker, insignia, the whole thing. He was, in fact, a pretty scary guy. I did not recruit him. One of our recruiters, we had people working the line downstairs and bringing people up to us. And he's going through the book, and he's just flipping the pages, like, and I'm thinking, he's here for his 10 bucks. Fine, we'll get through it, no problem. And all of a sudden, he gets to a page that's a wall of words. I'm really beginning to whether he can read because he's so not focusing on the pages. And he suddenly looks at it and he says, "What's this vote by mail thing? This is words in the middle of the page." Right? Well, I just learned about 14 things right there. So I explained it. It was something new. Explained it to him, and he went, "I haven't voted in 10 years. I said, "Well, you used to vote, why not?" And he says, "Well, bitch I was married to. She used to make me go. I'm hanging out with different people now." And I said, He said, "But this vote by mail thing, that means I could vote and they wouldn't know I did it, huh?" Yeah, it was interesting. It was a perspective on privacy that is not the usual perspective on privacy around voting. And we learned, in fact, that he's a really high-functioning reader. Just because he's tough now doesn't mean he was always that. But the other kind of language is, in fact, national languages, language. And we started out sort of with bilinguals. We started out with some interpreters. And we've actually shifted completely now to say what we do now is we hire somebody, usually a student. So we're looking for someone young to balance our age, who is a native speaker. And we teach them to run the session. Right? And we sit with them, and it sets up this fantastic dynamic. First of all, they are absolutely culturally appropriate because they are from the culture. It says, we value your community enough to make you part of the culture. We get them to introduce us as their co-researchers. And then you get this third dynamic, which is occasionally there'll be little sidebar, rapid-fire sidebar conversations in language, which I think add up to, and I've queried them afterwards, add up to, make sure that woman knows what you're saying. Make sure you're getting this right. And we get interesting three-way conversations going, and all of a sudden, after the first 5 minutes, people kind of relax and settle into it. It takes so much pressure off of it, but we schedule debrief time in between to just go back over the session. And it's been amazing and fun, and it's bringing more people into user research who don't usually do it. So one of the questions, I want to come back to this quantitative question, is so how well do we in fact cover the demographics of, say, California with an approach like this? We spent the better part of a year crisscrossing California looking for participants in all kinds of crazy places. We characterized them by their age cohort. We did pretty well on that. We were actually skewing towards younger voters because there's a lot known about older voters. We categorized them by when they'd last voted into a voting cohort, and we got a pretty good spread of that. We actually matched the voter registration numbers almost exactly, which was pretty surprising to me. We matched our race ethnicity as we intended to. We under-recruited whites, we under-recruited blacks, over-recruited Asians and Hispanics. So we actually managed that quite well. And at the end, to be able to say we had 99. I wanted to go out and get one more participant, right? But we had almost 100 participants. And that we actually did, in the end, do the kind of demography that we would have done had we done careful recruiting, just by paying attention to who we were talking to. We had one last lovely participant. We were in a mall, and the Santa Claus came over to ask if he could do it too. So I think it invites people in, and all the lovely things that intercepts do to invite people in. Someone asked about incentives before, so I should just say, the incentive we usually have is food. We have prepackaged snacks, a mix of healthy and unhealthy things, so people can choose. And we do get people who kind of circle around, and when they circle around twice, we invite them to sit down because they're looking for that food, and they don't know what they need to do to get it, so we grab them. And if what they really want is just to get the food and go, we give it to them. One place we went, the election officials actually got loaves of bread from a bakery, which I thought was unwieldy and large and wouldn't work at all, but it was at a community center where people were coming in for lunch. And those were immensely popular and less expensive than the $10 incentive we might have given otherwise. So that's our story. We've really kind of switched our thinking from recruiting people to recruiting communities and then gathering representatives of the community from where we go. We think about how how we're entering their lives to learn about why and how they do or don't do the thing we're interested in, which is voting. And it's really paid off remarkably well, and we're using it almost all the time now. Occasionally we will do signs in a community center that say we'll be there and have a sign-up form so you can actually sign up for a time slot just to make sure we have a few people, but almost everything we're doing is intercepts these days. So thank you.